In September of 1944, a German Luftwaffe signals intelligence officer named Major Werner Gerlach sat down in his headquarters outside Paris and wrote an internal assessment of what his unit had and had not detected in the weeks before the Allied landing at Normandy. He was not writing for publication. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing for his commanding general, and he was writing with the cold precision of a man who understood that the document in front of him was an accounting of failure. His unit had been responsible for monitoring Allied radio traffic across the Channel. They had listened to millions of transmissions. They had found thousands of signals. They had tracked unit call signs, radio procedures, transmission patterns, and the subtle indicators that signals intelligence professionals use to build a picture of an enemy's order of battle from nothing but the electromagnetic signature of his communications. They had heard everything. They had understood almost none of it. What Gerlach wrote in that assessment, preserved in captured German records at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, was this. The Allied signals picture in the weeks before June 6, 1944 had been, in his professional judgment, the most disciplined radio deception he had encountered in 5 years of signals warfare. The formations he had tracked, the call signs he had logged, the traffic patterns he had mapped to specific unit locations in Kent and East Anglia, had been exactly what they appeared to be and exactly nothing like what they actually were. He had been reading a script. He did not know it yet, but the script had a name. It was called Operation Fortitude. And the men who wrote it had spent 18 months building a fictional army in southeastern England so convincing that German signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, and human intelligence had all read it independently and reached the same wrong conclusion. To understand what Gerlach had missed, and why it mattered as much as anything else in the entire campaign, you have to understand what German intelligence believed in the spring of 1944. By April of that year, German Army Group B under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was defending approximately 2,000 miles of Atlantic coastline from Norway to the Spanish border with roughly 58 divisions. They could not be everywhere at once. The strategic problem Rommel faced was not whether the Allies would land, but where. The answer to that question would determine where he positioned his armored reserves, which sectors he reinforced, and whether his forces would be at the beaches before the Allies consolidated or arriving 3 days late into a beachhead already too strong to destroy. German intelligence in the spring of 1944 believed the answer was the Pas de Calais. The reasoning was sound. The Pas de Calais was the narrowest point of the English Channel, roughly 20 miles across at its minimum. It offered the shortest sea crossing, the most direct route into Germany, the best port facilities in northern France. Every operational planning study conducted by OKW and Army Group B concluded that a rational Allied commander choosing an invasion site would choose the Pas de Calais. The conclusion was not wrong. A rational commander might well have chosen it. But the conclusion was also exactly what the Allied deception planners wanted German intelligence to conclude. And they had spent 18 months making sure it did. The organization responsible for Allied deception operations in the European theater was a small unit operating under the London Controlling Section. Its work was coordinated by a group that went by the innocuous designation the 20 Committee, run by John Masterman, an Oxford academic who had spent the war years turning a theoretical talent for puzzle solving into a practical talent for running enemy agents. What Masterman's committee had achieved by the spring of 1944 was something that had no real precedent in the history of intelligence operations. They had rolled up the entire German human intelligence network in Britain. Every agent the Abwehr believed to be operating in the United Kingdom was by 1944 either dead, imprisoned, or reporting to MI5 instead of Berlin. The network the German intelligence service trusted was a managed fiction, feeding its handlers a picture of Britain designed specifically to confirm German fears about the Pas de Calais and to conceal the actual invasion preparations in southern England. The most important individual in that managed fiction was an agent the British ran under the code name Garbo. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia. He was a Spaniard with no intelligence training and no military background who had approached British intelligence in 1941 because he genuinely despised fascism and wanted to do something about it. The British, initially skeptical, eventually understood that they had stumbled onto something extraordinary. Pujol had already, on his own initiative and before making contact with London, convinced the Abwehr that he was a Spanish nationalist willing to spy for Germany. He had invented a network of sub-agents in Britain so convincingly that his German handlers were paying him for reports he was fabricating from Spanish-language guidebooks and the London newspaper archives. By 1944, Pujol's fictional network had grown to 27 notional sub-agents spread across Britain. Not one of them existed. Every report they filed was written by Pujol in consultation with his MI5 handler. His German handlers trusted him so completely that they awarded him the Iron Cross Second Class for the quality of his intelligence product. What Pujol reported in the months before D-Day was exactly what the 20 Committee needed German intelligence to believe. He reported the order of battle and location of a fictional formation called the 1st United States Army Group, supposedly under the command of General George Patton, apparently concentrated in Kent and East Anglia and apparently preparing for an assault on the Pas de Calais. The notional FUSAG had a headquarters with real radio traffic. It had units with real call signs. It had a commanding general who was real, which helped, because Patton was exactly the kind of aggressive armor commander the Germans would expect to see leading the main Allied assault. Patton's presence at the head of FUSAG was itself a deception. His actual role in the spring of 1944 was to command Third Army, which would not be activated until after the breakout from Normandy. In the meantime, he toured Britain giving speeches that German intelligence dutifully reported, attended functions that the Abwehr's managed sources described, and served as the visible flag over a formation that existed almost entirely on paper. Werner Gerlach's Signals Intelligence Unit was listening to the radio traffic of that formation. They heard what they expected to hear. A large American Army group in the southeast of England, generating the volume and pattern of communications appropriate to a formation of its reported size, doing the things a formation preparing for a major amphibious operation would do. Every transmission was real. The formation was not. The physical component of the deception was designed to confirm what the signals were saying. Dummy encampments appeared in Kent and East Anglia, visible to Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance, their internal layout consistent with real military installations but their contents hollow. Inflatable tanks and rubber landing craft sat in fields and marshalling areas. The scale was large enough that low-altitude photography would show military concentration areas consistent with the FUSAG order of battle. High-altitude photography would show logistics buildup patterns appropriate to an assault force preparing to cross the narrowest point of the channel. The Luftwaffe's aerial reconnaissance of Britain in the spring of 1944 was already seriously degraded. RAF Fighter Command had spent 4 years refining the radar network and ground control intercept procedures that made high-altitude penetration over southern England expensive in aircraft and aircrews. By 1944, sustained photographic coverage of specific target areas in Britain required a kind of attrition that the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance units could no longer absorb. Most sorties turned back before reaching the coast. Many that pressed on did not return. What the reconnaissance aircraft that did get through brought back tended to confirm the fortitude picture. Military concentration in the southeast. Shipping buildup in the Thames estuary and the ports of Kent. Logistics. Assembly patterns in East Anglia. All of it consistent with FUSAG. All of it pointing toward the Pas de Calais. The actual assembly areas for the Normandy invasion were in Hampshire, Dorset, and Devon. The actual embarkation ports were Portsmouth, Southampton, Weymouth, and Plymouth. The actual convoys were assembling in the western Solent and the anchorages off the Isle of Wight. The Luftwaffe was not looking there. It was looking in Kent. On the morning of June 6, 1944, when the first Allied paratroopers were already on the ground in Normandy and the first landing craft were approaching the beaches, the German command still did not know where the main assault was coming. The first reports reaching Army Group B headquarters described airborne landings in Normandy and what appeared to be a naval assault on the beaches between the Orne River and the Cotentin Peninsula. The reports were alarming, but they were not immediately interpreted as the main Allied effort, because Garbo was already working to ensure they were not. In the early hours of June 6, in a sequence of communications that has become one of the most discussed episodes in the history of intelligence operations, Pujol transmitted to his Abwehr handlers a message that described the Normandy landings as a diversionary assault, a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the Pas de Calais before the real strike by FUSAG. He reported that his sub-agents in southern England confirmed that the main force was still in place in Kent and East Anglia and had not moved. This was not true. But it was exactly what the German command needed to hear to make the decision that the Allied planners most needed them to make. Hitler held the Panzer Reserves. The 1st SS Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, the most powerful armored formations in France, sat in their assembly areas east of Paris and waited for orders that did not come. Rommel, who understood that the panzers had to reach the beaches within hours or not at all, could not get Hitler to release them. The Führer, operating on the intelligence picture that Garbo and 18 months of managed reporting had constructed, believed Normandy was a diversion. The real blow was coming at the Pas de Calais. The panzers had to be there when it came. They were not released on June 6. By the time the German command began to accept that Normandy was not a diversion, the moment for a decisive counterattack had already passed. The Allied beachhead was consolidating. The logistics were flowing. The airborne divisions were linking up with the seaborne forces. The window during which a concentrated armored blow could have pushed the invasion back into the sea was closing by the hour. Werner Gerlach's assessment, written in September 1944 as his unit retreated east before the Allied breakout, acknowledged the failure in the measured language of a professional who understood what had happened but could not quite explain how it had been allowed to happen. He wrote that the Allied deception had been constructed at every level simultaneously. The signals picture, the photographic picture, and the human intelligence picture had all pointed in the same direction. In his professional experience, when 3 independent sources converged on the same conclusion, that conclusion was reliable. What he had not fully accounted for was the possibility that the convergence itself was the deception. That the same hand was writing all 3 pictures. That was the thing the British had understood and the Germans had not. The convergence was not evidence of truth. It was the mechanism of the lie. Juan Pujol Garcia received the member of the British Empire from the British government and the Iron Cross second class from the German government. He is the only person in the history of the Second World War to have been decorated by both sides. After the war he faked his own death, moved to Venezuela, and lived for decades under an assumed name before finally emerging in the 1980s to give interviews and attend commemorations. He died in Caracas in 1988. John Masterman published his account of the 20 Committee's operations in 1972 under the title The Double Cross System. It remains one of the clearest and most honest accounts of how a strategic deception is actually constructed and sustained over time. He described the operation with the academic precision of a man who had thought carefully about what it meant that a small group of people in a London office had managed to construct a fictional picture of reality so complete and so consistent that an entire military command had made life and death decisions based on it. Rommel, for his part, had his doubts about the intelligence picture throughout the spring of 1944. He had written in his own papers that he thought the Allies might land in Normandy. He thought the logical choice and the actual choice might not be the same thing. He had pushed for stronger defenses in the Normandy sector. He had not been given everything he asked for. He was in Germany visiting his wife on June 6, 1944. Nobody had told him the invasion was coming that night. The weather forecasters had said conditions were too poor. The Allied meteorologists had found a window in the weather that the German forecasters missed. Werner Gerlach, sitting in his headquarters in September 1944 writing his assessment of signals failure, had spent 5 years listening to Allied radio traffic. He was good at his job. He had correctly identified real formations, real movements, real preparations in dozens of other operations throughout the war. He had not been wrong because he was incompetent. He had been wrong because the people on the other side of the channel were better than he was. They had built something he did not have a framework to recognize, and they had done it so completely and so consistently across so many independent channels that the convergence looked like truth. It was the most expensive fiction in the history of warfare. It cost Germany the war in the West.